All right. Let's get fired up here.
Maximum freedom. Read.
Stay on target.
Maximum.
Stay on target.
Maximum freedom. Read Rothbard.
Hello and welcome to the Actual Anarchy podcast, the podcast where we talk about movies from a Rothbardian and Anarcho-Capitalist perspective. Tonight, we're going to commemorate the 101st anniversary of the Armistice, which is the marking of the ceasefire and the end of the hostilities in the Great War, now known as World War I. We are talking about Peter Jackson's They Shall Not Grow Old. This is episode 154 of the show, and the show notes and more can be found at actualanarchy.com/154. My co-host is Robert Johnson. How are you doing, sir? I saw that you have been making progress on your new business venture. Saw a couple of logo iterations, and I like the second one more than the first, but they're both pretty good.
Oh, well, thank you very much, sir. Yeah, we're going with that second one until I come up with something even better than that. But I've been getting some good feedback, and we're getting a little bit of traction. So things are looking good. Yeah,
that is good. And just to throw this out there, if anyone wants a kick-ass logo, they should get in touch with this guy, my co-host Robert, because he's quite good at it. And, you know, if you want good stuff, you got to go to the right place, and he's the right place.
Oh, well, thank you very much. I do what I can.
So tonight, we are talking about this movie, a bit of a documentary, and we were intending to have another guest on, but plans fell through. So we have our old pal, Mike C., who's going to be joining us when we get into last night's portion of the show. But any other updates from your side before we get into that, Robert?
Updates. No, things are just moving along. I'm very busy, but I mean, of course, I've seen this film, and I've got a lot of things to say about it, and I think our guest does too. So I'm excited to get into it.
All right. Well, without further ado, we shall commence. Hey everyone, it's Daniel Elwood and Robert Johnson, The Last Nighters, and The Last Nighters can be found on the Launchpad Media, where they're always launching new ideas in your direction. Tonight is episode 97 of the show. You can find the show notes more at lastnighters.com/97. We were talking about They Shall Not Grow Old, Peter Jackson's documentary take on the conflict, now known as World War I. It's a bringing to life account with footage that is over 100 years old, coupled with interviews that are about 50 years old, mated together with modern technology to bring vibrancy and color, including sound effects and lip-synced audio, to bring you a never-before experienced look at the horrors of the Great War. Tonight is our pal Mike C. will be joining us for this discussion as the stars went out of alignment with our previously scheduled guest, Jeff Deist of the Mises Institute, who has penned an excellent review article of this movie, and I will post that on the show notes page at lastnighters.com/97. It's a very good take, and I know that a lot of our discussion with him would have kind of circled around that, so I think that because it fell through, we're going to have other things to talk about, so you can read that and listen to this and get even more content for your hard-earned dollars. Something along those lines, right, Robert?
Yeah, something like that, Daniel.
Yeah, something like that. And if you do like what we do here, we do pre-show and post-show content available for our Patreon supporters. So you can hit us up at lastnighters.com/Patreon and find out which levels get you which goodies. But Mike C., our guest for previous shows, most recently being The Warriors, one of his favorite movies. How are you doing, sir? Thank you for filling in while Jeff is unable to make it as he's with Ron Paul this weekend. So I guess he had like different priorities.
Ending the Fed?
Something along those lines. Yeah, I think that's a pretty good priority.
Like from what I've learned solely by memes, that's the only real information I have about Ron Paul is that that's all he does is attempt to end the Fed.
It's a pretty noble cause. And I might add that Ron Paul was a very important and influential person in my life. He's the one who kind of planted that seed and got me over to the libertarian anarchist philosophy that I now hold.
Fair enough. Yeah, him and Bernie Sanders, of all people, teamed up to try to get an audit of the Fed. It ended up passing eventually, but it was too watered down to do anything by the time it got through. And I thought that was kind of interesting, the bedfellows desperation mix.
Yeah, I do recall that. And that was back a time in my life when Bernie Sanders actually kind of made some sense to me. and so I was actually on his mailing list for a while.
Nice.
and yeah, I remember him talking with Ron Paul and seeing his name mixed in there, and I think that was my gateway into Ron Paul, actually.
Fair enough. Yeah, I used to like Tarantino as well. You grow up.
How dare you, sir?
Well, I think becoming an adult is realizing that Guy Ritchie does what Tarantino would want to do, but just better.
Guy Ritchie?
Yeah, absolutely.
Aladdin?
No, he didn't do Aladdin, did he? Like, they force him. He makes these movies and they bomb, and then they force him to do movies that like will make money. Like he's currently doing basically like the third iteration of the Snatch and Lock, Stock. So they forced him to do Rock and Roller after he bombed 2 movies, and now he's bombed a couple more, so he has to like pay his dues again before they give him the $100 million to make an action film.
I have heavy doubts. He hasn't made a good movie since Lock, Stock, and Snatch.
Man from U.N.C.L.E. was good. Yeah. Revolver is fantastic. Swept Away is good. I even like that one about King Arthur. So
wow.
Okay, if you don't like it though, that's fine. We can be like a Tarantino and a Guy Ritchie guy. We can.
Yeah. You guys.
You can be like
the Coke and Pepsi here.
It's like pinball and video games, or dog people and cat people.
Well, as much as we like you, Mike, I did share your recommendation for Under the Silver Lake with Robert, and he was like, "Well, what's that one about?" And I'm like, "I don't really know, but Mike really recommends it." And he was like, "Well, we know what movies that Mike recommends are like." So,
I got a friend like that. He saw Terminator: Dark Fate, and I said, "Oh, what do you think about it?" And he's like, "Oh, I really liked it." I'm like, "That's all I need to know."
It's woke. That's all you need to know.
Yeah, that's the one living at home, by the way.
All right. Well, hey, Mike, you want to mention any of your goodies for our audience? I'm sure they're familiar with you so far, or at this point, since you've been on with us 5 or 6 times by now.
Like my SoundCloud?
Yeah, your SoundCloud's got some new stuff.
Yeah, that's kind of the only thing that I'm doing that's getting out there right now. Anyway, I'm on SoundCloud. It's Mechanical Dream Revolution. It's really kick-ass. It's getting better every day. So go check out my new album, Don't Fuck Kids. Which is kind of a PSA style, 1930s PSA style is the motif. There's a lot of good trance in there and like a bunch of, I don't know, it's like experimental. Like I don't even know how to describe this genre at this point.
No, yeah, it's a mix of copyrighted content along with other copyrighted content mixed in with some beats and some news clips. And it's actually pretty compelling stuff. I give it a fair number of listens. And you did mention the PSA style. What was it? I watched Death of Stalin not too long ago, and they literally had like a poster like "Don't eat your children."
The Humidor, right?
Yeah.
That's a real thing.
Yeah. So
and that's like before Peterson got caught being a meth addict. He used that. That was one of his staple sort of attack patterns, as he'd talk about how the commies had propaganda posters to not eat your children, or not even just PSA posters to not eat your children because of the starvation that occurred under Stalin, right? In the Ukraine, I guess.
Yep, because parents need to be told not to eat their kids.
Well, they do if they're starving, I guess. And you've made the individual such a negative concept that's like completely outside the realm of their thinking that they just see other people as cogs in a machine and children as food.
If you're at a point in your life where you're thinking about eating your kids, I don't think a poster is going to sway you one way or the other. Yeah,
no, fair enough. Well, it's kind of like the anti like a campaign to be like, don't rape girls, and I'm like, yeah, I know, but I don't think that's going to convince rapists.
Yeah, sounds like the whole gun control argument.
Yeah,
like, well, the criminals aren't going to
have a gun and not need it. Then
anyway, speaking of guns and horrible events, let's talk about They Shall Not Grow Old in World War I. So we normally start out with the Google description, and just a reminder, this is episode 97 of the show. Show notes more at lastnighters.com/97. You can find the links to Jeff Dice's movie review and also Mike C's Mechanical Dream Revolution SoundCloud profile, where you can listen to the music that he has created there. It is quite good. All right, so They Shall Not Grow Old came out in 2018. It's a history/war movie, 2 hours and 12 minutes, 8.3 IMDb, 100% Rotten Tomatoes, and 91% on Metacritic, with 95% of Google users liking it. The description reads, using state-of-the-art technology and materials from the BBC and the Imperial War Museum, the filmmaker Peter Jackson allows the story of World War I to be told by the men who are there. Life on the front is explored through the voices of the soldiers who discuss their feelings about the conflict, the food they ate, the friends they made, and their dreams of the future. This came out in Russia and Canada on October 16th, 2018, had a limited release in the United States shortly thereafter and made $19.9 million at the box office. Peter Jackson was a director. I read that he looked at over 600 different interviews or 600 hours of footage. It took him about a year to figure out what he wanted to include, and he accepted no payment for his work on this. So that is the description, and I'll go to Robert first, and then we'll go to Mike. So, Robert, your take on that, and then anything you would like to open with.
Well, it definitely seemed like a labor of love. And at the very end of the film, he does say, like, this is for my grandfather or something like that. So it very much seemed like somebody that wanted to do something in remembrance of the people that mattered to him in his life.
So, yeah, the one thing that really strikes you when you watch this film is, well, first of all, the footage. I've never seen World War I look this good. The only time I've seen video of World War I, it's been black and white, grainy as hell, tiny, and of course there's never any sound because they didn't have microphones and whatnot back then. So
right, and the frame rate's all off, right? So it like kind of looks janky.
Yeah, but this is all smoothed out, like you said. It's colorized really, really well. I mean, it's not perfect, but how could it be? And yeah, like there's the overdubbing that lip syncs perfectly, or almost perfectly, with the video. It's impressive. It's impressive technical achievement. And then it's also kind of unique in that it really is just a bunch of grunts telling their story, the good and the bad, and not really interjecting politics into it, even though that's what I would want to do. But it really is just, turning on the camera and the microphone and interviewing these guys about what they experienced. And in that, I think it's a fitting remembrance and memorial for these guys and what they went through. I think it turns out to be a anti-war film just because of the nature of it. They don't really shy away from showing the bloated corpses and the rats and the muck and the garbage and the filth that they had to deal with on a daily basis, on a constant basis in the trenches. I've mentioned many times the Hardcore History podcast that I've listened to by Dan Carlin, who does I think he did like a 25-hour take on World War I, and he really gets into the idea that the muck that was created, and they show it in this film. They have these pathways, like just like wood pathways, and if you fell off, you're pretty much dead because you get stuck in this muck, and it's like quicksand, and you fight and you struggle, and there's nothing anybody can do to get you out of it, and so then you just eventually suffocate and die, and it's just horrific. I was glad to see that here. I didn't know if I was going to get to see all the things that I heard in the podcast. And of course, he goes into greater detail about the World War I and all the different battles, like the Passchendaele and the Verdun and the Battle of the Somme. And he gets into those details. And this movie doesn't do that. It's more of a broad overview and really just the perspective of these kind of guys from England. But I got details here that I didn't get in the podcast with the them getting like boots that were really stiff and that they had to pee in them to soften them up, and just little details of how unprepared, and they just threw these guys into this situation, how untrained they were. And like you would imagine they're doing all these like calisthenics and a few things, but then they're just thrown right on the front line and just thrown into this meat grinder. If you want to know more about World War I highly recommend the podcast, because it does talk about the way the strategies and the way they fought this war really was this horrific meat grinder where they just threw wave after wave of human bodies at her in this war of attrition to just try and grind out this victory. And it really just massive human toll in this war. Anyway, it's a good movie.
All right. Well, thank you for that. Any thoughts from you, Mike, on the description or anything that Robert has opened with?
I forgive Peter Jackson for making The Hobbit. Everything he said. Like, technically, it's amazing. I don't know how they achieved this, but it's very objective. He doesn't get bogged down with the politics. And I mean, I guess it's like, if you wanted to fault it, I guess you could say it's like one-sided, but I'm not sure how else to tell a story. They certainly cover the propaganda and excitement and the inversion of our best qualities to the will of the state, which is a horrific betrayal of your people, without getting into it. He just does the interviews and shows some of the posters and propaganda and stuff like that. And and then just kind of matter of factly talked about the just horrific conditions that the soldiers had to survive in. So
Right.
yeah,
And
no,
they were in there for so long that they became desensitized to all of this, to where it didn't even affect them any longer, or they could laugh at a corpse and like the guy was smoking a pipe, or they would put a pipe in this bloated corpse as a joke, because
well, what do you do? Yeah.
their humanity had shifted so much based on the trauma that they all experienced.
Well, and then drinking water out of a gas can, right?
Right, with still the stale remnant of gasoline taste.
You're like,
I mean,
all right,
I thought drinking out of my kids, plastic water bottles was bad. I ain't seen nothing.
no, we got it pretty easy. I think about that every day. Like running water is pretty sweet. Electricity, access to gasoline, like all of this. Like, you ever watch Downton Abbey?
Yeah. I actually wanted to bring up
the
Downton
first
Abbey.
season plot line was World War One, right?
Right, and how excited everyone was.
And
run
just
up to it.
but you just think about like the living conditions, like what like an elite person even would have is in terms of comfortability and like quality of life, and what a peasant, And
Right.
so it's just interesting seeing like 100 years ago how people were living and like what they would put up with on a battlefield, like just sleeping in the mud, like no one rebelled against it.
Yeah, well, I mean, in a lot of ways, I think it wasn't all that different for the average person. I mean, I don't want to say it like exactly like, oh, of course, their average life is like being in war, but basically they weren't coming from a high, comfortable place, right?
No, they're like lower middle class, right?
Right, yeah, and so they didn't have all these modern conveniences and any of those things. So their lives were pretty bleak. They probably, what was it, like 100 years ago, people didn't travel more than like 10 miles from where they grew up in their entire life.
Yeah. Well, they even talk about it like near the end. They started talking about brothels and how the experience would have just been so much more lively than whatever they would have grown up in.
Right. Yeah.
As teenagers, 19-year-old guy like encountering a French brothel. It's pretty out there.
Right. And then the Downton Abbey thing. They really did play up the excitement that all the characters had in the run up to the war.
Yeah, it's all just so fun.
And I mean, apparently that was actually a real thing. People were excited about this because there was a long period of relative peace in Europe for a long time. And I think wars had sort of this nostalgic reminiscence quality that like was noble.
And if you think about in terms of, because that would have been the colonialist era as well, right? So like the last war Britain was in was the Zulu War, where they're mowing down Shaka Zulu's troops with the Maxim gun, right? So
right. So they
I'd rather be on that end.
Right. Yeah. So it doesn't seem like it's that terrible if you're on the winning side. And
well, also you're going out. You know what I mean? You're expanding from your position. You're not. Like it's a very uncivilized war. World War One. Like they weren't. They used chemistry for the first time, chemical weapons. Stuff like that.
Right. Yeah.
Well, and the big distance between wars allowed for a massive technological advancement.
Yeah. And a big forgetting.
Right, and they didn't understand. Like they had this idea that war is this grand adventure, and you might get winged or whatever, but it's not in super horrific conditions. But they didn't understand that this massive shift in technology had increased, and like all of a sudden you got these massive artillery batteries, and the chemical weapons, like you say, and you got airplanes actually, and machine guns, and like the French went into World War I with hats, cloth hats.
Yep.
Like having no understanding. Like people are still riding like horses. I mean, turns out horses are actually better in the muck and the mud than some of these early machines. But it was just a world that was unprepared, didn't understand. Like the politicians didn't understand it, and the men that were going in to fight it didn't understand how technology had changed war until they were faced with it.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, we get the first tanks at the end, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And at the beginning, I think they open with talking about the people who are first entering the war. They won't recognize it by the end because they go in with this conception that it is sort of this civilized version that they had heard historically, and it's nothing like that.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, because they're still thinking of like cavalry charges with horses and that sort of like heroic last, charge of the light brigade kind of stuff. When a cavalry charge against, fixed machine gun emplacements aren't going to really do too well.
No, that's why we invented that specifically as a counter to the current tactics. Realistically, like we had guns, and it's like moving. Yeah, sorry, getting to the strategy and like how it's just interesting how we develop weaponry as like basically we develop a weapon specifically for the conditions that exist. and then everything, the entire paradigm shifts to machine gun installations and artillery. And then we invent tanks because we need a way to get past machine guns. You know,
constant arms race in the literal sense. Like you're always trying to outdo or overcome. I remember I played a game on the PlayStation, like Panzer General, and each of the different armaments and different kind of vehicles and things you had different abilities. Some had more defensive, some had more offensive, and you would have to strategically place them and use them, maneuver them to cover your flank and, make sure that you're not going to sustain a bunch of damage and then, defeat the enemy. And you kind of see that, in real life kind of happening. And somebody, I forget who it was that said this, but you're always like, in your preparations for the next war, you're always arming yourself as if you're going to be fighting the last war. And I think that's
the French especially.
Right. And that's very true with World War I, as we're discussing here.
Yeah, it was a marginal line for, I got to try very hard not to talk about World War II. So I'll just say, I'll make my one comment, which is that the French were prepared for World War I in World War II. They got really used to the ideas of it. And they're like, okay, we'll have this big, we'll make the trench, but we'll make it out of like concrete and we won't have like water filling up inside of it and mud. It'll be great. And they were like,
yeah, the Maginot Line was very much an antiquated design as soon as they were done building it.
But like, that's my point though, is everything is, right? Like, you get ships with cannons, like cannons, has its lifespan. And like, you'd have to build a fort. Like castles didn't work anymore because they couldn't withstand the artillery. So you had to build a fort that had cannons on them. And they built like these sort of triangular designs, and the engineers were completely different mindsets. And it's just like all this infrastructure has to go into it, and all of this research and development. And then it's only for one iteration. They have to move on to the next thing almost immediately.
Yeah, there's a couple of forts near us where Robert and I are that are on the Puget Sound, and they're on various sides. So it creates a triangular firing zone for any foreign vessel trying to enter. But they were built in 1880s, and they were only active through, I think, World War I, maybe.
Yeah. No, they'd be useless in World War I because the artillery would go further. So they would have been okay. Or were they? It sounds like they would have been for earlier stuff, like Civil War era, ironclads and such.
Yeah, probably would have been more effective versus ironclads.
Yeah, so and there's a really interesting period, right? Because like ironclads were around for about 15 minutes. we went from wooden ships to these weird iron ships that were steam powered, and then immediately moved past that because it was just kind of retarded. You know what we should do? There's a movie called it's Matthew McConaughey called Dirt, where he's looking for a sunken what's it called? Ironclad in Africa filled with gold.
Is it called Dirt or is it Mud? I know he's in a movie.
Oh, Mud, maybe. I don't know, something like that.
Okay.
No, Mud's a different story. I think Mud's like a sad dad taking care of his kid or something.
Yeah.
Okay. Well,
so I don't mean to derail this. I just
no. We'll look it up.
It's a much more lighthearted killing in those kinds of movies. This was just there's a lot. It's very sad. Like World War I makes me very sad. They all do, but like just the story about the soccer. Like that's pretty common known, and I don't know. Like I'm pretty sure that's true. I don't think that's just some myth because it doesn't serve. It doesn't serve like
the Christmas tree miracle. The Christmas miracle?
Like that doesn't serve the state, right?
Right.
Because we need
thing.
And there were cases of like French and German soldiers being armed and encountering each other off the battlefield and not killing each other, like shouting at each other and telling each other to fuck off and not knowing the language and throwing rocks and stuff at each other, kicking dirt. And then just going their separate ways without even considering shooting each other, which is just, I don't know. So like that's like, that tells you a lot about humanity and what it takes to get people to shoot each other.
Yeah. When you were mentioning the soccer thing, you were talking about the Christmas miracle where there was like a ceasefire and then they fraternized with the enemy.
Yeah.
But I thought you were talking about in this movie, They Shall Not Grow Old. They actually talked about how some of the commanders would get their people to charge by actually kicking a ball and having everyone follow it. And I thought that was really sad.
Yeah, that is pretty sad. So like men like orders. We like being told what to do. In relationships, a lot of problems can be solved if women tell men exactly what they want and give them tasks, and then men do the opposite. But we speak different languages, right? So the male brain really, that's why we fall for joining up and being in the army and why it's actually kind of enjoyable because you have a task. There's structure to that. Like it's quite satisfying. They talked about how like it felt like camping and when they weren't having to shoot each other. It's kind of like hanging out with the boys.
Yeah, and it was quite telling how they kind of got comfortable towards the end of the war. How they had been, conditioned
or
to
acclimated, maybe
lifestyle. Yeah,
Yeah.
Now, of course, these are the guys that are being interviewed are the ones that made it, the ones that survived. Of course, they're not the ones that got horrific shell shock, now known as PTSD. Back in the day, shell shock wasn't even understood. It wasn't even a thing until World War One. And the men that got it were seen as cowards and were often murdered by their own companymen for not, being seen as cowards, like as a betrayal or trying to go AWOL or something like that, or because they wouldn't fight.
Or even in this movie, they said some of the guys were screaming and they thought it'd be giving away their position, and so they would shoot the guy.
Ruins morale too.
Right. Sure. But yeah, and then they'd shoot the guy, sort of like in that Tom Cruise movie that we talked about a couple of years ago, where you're like, Tom Cruise kills this guy to keep the aliens from finding him. What do you think? Because if the guy isn't quiet, they're both going to get found and get killed.
Yeah. So to cost benefit analysis.
Right. Although, I mean, that's the insanity of a guy is screaming and you can hear them over the sound of the detonating explosions, kind of. Oh no, they're going to know where we are over the deafening roar of the thunderous bombs.
Oh no. I think it's more about the morale, because I don't think it's like a broken window in a neighborhood. You don't want to let them do that, because you're going to have disorder, and you want to keep everybody not thinking about themselves as people or their fear. You need them to go kill other people that they don't even know, right? So you really got to nip that in the bud.
Yeah.
So it'd be a good trade, right? If you kill one of your own soldiers to keep everyone in line.
I wanted to bring up another point from a movie we talked about a while ago, Legends of the Fall, where the dad character played by Anthony Hopkins, he was in World War One, and so he witnessed these horrors. No? Oh, was it?
No, Hopkins was not. He was in like the war, the American Indian War.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
Okay. And that was World War One.
We're going into World War One.
Right, and they were super excited about it. Okay. Yeah. So Hopkins had experienced war conditions more recently than apparently people in England had. The
last one, it would have been the Zulu War, right?
Something like that, yeah. And also England had sort of given off this air of their prosperity was due to their colonialism, and that's actually a fallacy. It was not a net positive for them. It was very costly. It was the Industrial Revolution and their improved industrial base and capacity that actually improved the living standards. But because the impression was that, you go out on conquest and then you'll reap all these spoils, that incited Germany, Italy, Spain, Portugal to have like all of these encroachments around the world. And compete for, the Italians were busy collecting deserts, as Ralph Raico says in this really great talk on World War One that I will post on the show notes page. And that's just kind of related to the hardcore history that Robert was talking about. There's a bunch of stuff at the Mises Institute that is really just excellent on the politics around World War One and what it allowed governments to do in something called the ratchet effect that Robert Higgs talks about. Rothbard has an essay called World War One is Fulfillment for the Power and Intellectual Elite that's related to his book, The Progressive Era. And then, of course, there's a great book called Cost of War that is highly recommended. So I'll post all that on our show notes page as well. But anyway, I didn't mean to derail us too much there with my little plugs here. Who did I cut off? Was it Mike?
I don't know. I'm used to cutting people off, so...
But if you want to talk the origins of the war, Carlin does talk a lot about the spider web of alliances, like all the European elites are all intermarried, like they're all cousins or stepbrothers or whatever, and you had like Germany or England pledging to protect Belgium, which was allied with Spain or France, it's just all around. And basically what happened was when Archduke Franz Ferdinand got assassinated in Kosovo. Or was it Serbia? I forget. Anyway.
Serbia? Oh, no, Serbian killed him. Yeah, no, it's a Serbian national.
Yeah, in Kosovo, right?
They had a parade there.
Yeah. Gavrilo Princip, I recall his name. Anyway, it just triggered this series of, so-and-so declaring war on these guys and these guys and these guys. And it just
Cascade.
This cascading shit show. It's easy to paint the Germans as the bad guys after the fact with a whole bunch of war propaganda about what they were doing in Belgium. But I mean, if you look at all the alliances and whatnot, they were the aggressors, kinda. But I don't know. It's
I did
not
the hand waving thing. Yeah, it's England was looking for a fight with Germany for a long time. Before that, they were outproducing, right? So when a group of people is outperforming you, you need to go in and like fuck them up sometimes.
Yeah, and
It's
of course,
kinda-
there's the whole lulling the U.S. into the war with Lusitania, and Woodrow Wilson, of course, running as a candidate who kept us out of war, and then he, of course, had ulterior motives and got us into the war.
Yeah, I would even the Lusitania is essentially a false flag.
Yeah,
Like they put it in harm's way on purpose, right?
and it's a British liner. It's carrying arms against whatever the rules were. And if I recall, there was even full-page ads taken out in the New York Times warning people not to go on the boat because it was going to be treated as a warship by the Germans.
Yep, they warned them. It was within their domain that they were patrolling. Yeah, it's crazy. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, it's. I think that a lot of powerful people were itching for a fight, and I'm not giving Germany a pass at all. I'm just saying that England wanted to fight Germany because Germany was outproducing stuff, and Germany was still interested in being like a conquering nation. So I think we could have avoided a lot of problems had Bismarck just occupied France for like 30 years, though, and the Franco-Prussian War kind of weeded out some of those Marxists there.
Is that when they took Alsace and Lorraine?
Yeah, and then they had a parade in Paris, right? Instead of conquering them, because they were kind of like, well, they're the French, we should respect their surrender culture. But yeah, I feel like there was like a burgeoning. A lot of me wants to blame World War I on the sort of cultural conditions that you get from like democratic socialism, like the elitism that comes out of that. I'm not like I don't really have threads to put them together, but like I don't imagine France is innocent in this, Germany's innocent in this, or England is innocent in this. And this idea that like one guy gets assassinated and everything cascades into like massive groups of people being at war with each other and 20 million people dying, like that's insane.
Right. Yeah. In the Reiko talk, he gives a lot of the he sets the stage for all these alliances and things that are in place to kind of get triggered to make this happen. And the von Schlieffen plan, that is basically knock out France and then go over and knock out the rest of Russia. But if Russia mobilizes before that, then Germany is kind of stuck. And so that was like a big challenge for them. And so Wilhelm, he would sign Willie, he would send notes to cousin Nicky, like, hey, stop mobilizing and stuff, because it's going to put us in a bad spot. And you're right, they were all related. And, a lot of this really could have been avoided and probably should have been avoided. And had it been avoided, we wouldn't have seen the second conflict that was even larger. And we wouldn't have had the communist takeover in Russia. We wouldn't have had Nazis rising in Germany. Like the entire 20th century would have been far, far different had this not happened.
Yeah. So I have to wonder, like, what kind of sort of overclass aspects were involved in that. Like nationalism's one thing, and I think a lot of people like to get onto the idea that like, oh, these nationalist nations were like a powder keg because they were all like nationalism is inherently like evil generally in the current narrative. A lot of historians look at this and go like, okay, well, it was like the last hurrah of the great elite. But I feel like there was probably a lot of economic conditions that we don't examine. You know what I mean? Because generally wars happen because somebody's like got too much freedom and they're producing stuff and trading it without being taxed properly or without having enough usury in the system. You know what I mean? Like free trading ports in sort of the southern states was probably a bigger factor than slavery for the Civil War, right? Stuff like that.
Yeah, I think there were a number of factors, and yeah, I think you're right there.
And I haven't really examined this, but I do know that like France was a bit of a shit show for like the cultural Marxism, right? There would have been like a lot of, I don't know, like feminism and that's the anarcho-communism essentially, right? The social, what do they call it? Democratic socialism, right? You would have had that sort of coming up.
You talking about early 20th century?
Yeah, like after Napoleon overextended himself trying to conquer the world, they would have fallen back into
early 18th century.
Yeah, and then from there you get the Franco-Prussian War, which doesn't actually annihilate these conditions, and so you get this like intellectualism. I'm sure had a factor in there. Is this? I don't know. I kind of like I don't really have like the notes. Sort of. I haven't studied the thinkers of that time the same way I have with like World War II or the Enlightenment period, and like what the movers and shakers. But I'm assuming that like Germany was overproducing. They were highly industrialized and doing good. They had kind of like assholes in charge as well, right? I mean, they were they were sort of the driving force with the chemical weapons, right? But like England had no business fighting them, so it doesn't make a lot of sense, except for this, like you said, they got like the bare minimum of excuses to form these huge alliances and start putting people in the meat grinder. So I don't know, like it doesn't feel like anybody was trying to get land though in this war.
Well, I thought Germany was definitely trying to gain land.
Like their old empire, I guess, eh? That's what they're going
I think
for.
they were trying to not be surrounded, as I understand it.
Right, because
Did they have access to the sea at that point?
Yes.
Well, yeah, I don't know.
North. Well, because Austria-Hungary was dying, and also being under a bunch of pressure for Slavic people to secede and create their own nation, and then Germany would have been surrounded on all sides by hostile neighbors.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's how I understand it.
Destroy this mad brute. So what? Like, all right, when is this poster from?
Oh, you're talking about that propaganda poster?
Yeah, I'm trying to think of like what this like, because I know that like they didn't like what Germany was doing, and they had a bunch of assholes in charge. We were trying to say anti-German sentiment. So I'm wondering like when this began, and if it just cascaded from the sort of scapegoating of them producing too much, right? Because like you said, like all this prosperity was coming out of the Industrial Revolution, and everyone was getting more and more free. So you kind of need to get everybody into a war to stop them from elevating themselves from being peasants.
Mm.
So I guess in that sense, it is just like the last hurrah of pseudo-monarchies.
Well, there's also this rising military-industrial system coming in. Like all this wealth is generating, and they're building up with all this new technology, and they've got all this wealth to suck off of.
Yeah, and I noticed
what do military contractors like, but to see their weapons put to use, and what do generals like, but to also do that.
And I noticed too, like a lot of he took a moment in the movie to talk about like all the canned goods and stuff, and those are huge military or government contracts. You know,
sure,
jam, tea, spam, beans, all that kind of stuff. So it's a huge what's that called, stimulus package. So that's what I'm assuming was happening, is that the countries that were falling behind the curve, like Russia was a bit behind the 8 ball in terms of industrial development, right?
They were very much an agrarian country all up until the early 1900s.
Yeah, so like, because they kind of fell a little bit behind with the same development that Europe was having, because the Mongols sort of decimated them for a little too long. And so if they're behind the 8 ball on that, then it would be a good stimulus package for that government to have a war, right? No,
maybe presented as such, but
I don't mean good in the actual sense, like objectively good. I mean it's a good control mechanism, is what I'm saying. A good economic control mechanism for the government to reinstate its power over the existing economy.
Right, and it's a gaudy implementation of resources that's very showy and visible.
Yeah,
but it belies the rot that it actually generates, because it is a parasitical nature.
Absolutely. But it's a stimulus package, right? Like war is the ultimate stimulus package.
It's a redistributive package. It's taking all these resources from other areas and injecting it into a very specific stream.
Yeah, I mean, but that's the same as any, like if you bail out a credit card company, or you put money to build planes or buses or something, it's all the same. Just war is like the most consumptuous, and therefore has the appearance of being the best way to stimulate an economy.
Well, it's the worst. It's the most destructive way. You're not even getting
right. It's an ultimate form of consumerism. So it's ideal, because there's for the government, I mean, it's ideal. It's obviously like the opposite of ideal for us.
Right, or actual consumers.
Yeah, but like it's a great way to keep everybody in line, right? So like with the Industrial Revolution, everybody's competing, right? Everybody, I don't know, like the economies of these countries were coming up, right? So the stakes would have been a little bit higher. And like I said, we had a burgeoning multinational banking system.
Were increasing, the wealth was increasing.
Yeah.
Prior to World War I, generally armies weren't that huge. They weren't so well supplied. You would have a few big battles and then you'd be done.
Yeah.
But with World War I, you had so much wealth and resources, and like essentially total war, where the entire country is mobilized to fight this war, that you had a constant stream of supplies going to the front, and you just had this meat grinder where human bodies were just, I mean, you saw the pictures of the gangrene and the trench foot.
Oh, absolutely. It's horrifying. And it's very terrible. Yeah, I should probably pick a better word than good. Effective, I guess. This is more. But it's not actually even effective either.
Resources in exchange for loyalty to the state.
Yeah. So it's we also had like the financing from like I said, a multinational banking cartel that was forming out of the era as well, right? That was pretty new, right? So you get like that system kind of came out of the French Revolution and then subsequently the Napoleonic era.
Yeah, and then you got Bank of England and the Federal Reserve had just been formulated just a few years prior.
Yeah. So without getting like a tinfoil hat on, I have to wonder like how in debt the leaders of countries and the governments of countries as an abstract were to these users, the banking system, because like you need to finance a war, right? And then the spoils are never going to outweigh what you've put into it at this point, because it's just we're not hitting each other with sharp sticks anymore. Like,
Wait,
it's
you mean
it's cost ineffective right now.
George Bush was wrong that the Iraq war would pay for itself in the bounty of oil?
You know, it almost did.
It's only off by a couple billion.
We
Yeah,
just need to go in there a little bit longer. That's another benefit too, right? Because we broke up the Ottoman Empire and we drew borders wherever the fuck we wanted, and then instilled our governments we wanted afterwards, which I think was another motivation. Like, I mean, the reason we have the Kurdish conflict is because they didn't give them a country. They're like, okay, this is what Iraq looks like, and there happens to be these people here and these people here, and in the back left there's another cluster of other ethnicity, and they all think that they are independent. And like I said, that was another product of World War One.
Right.
And I can't imagine that's like an accident to
Yeah,
break up this massive empire, right?
Very well may be. Now, we are actually getting a little bit long on this episode, so I want to make sure that we cover off a couple of any other notes that anyone has. But before we do that, I do want to bring up this idea that I had, and it's a bit of a theory, but that the concept of this being an anti-war film, because it does take that grainy Charlie Chaplin-esque imagery and brings it almost to life to where it's actually visible, the horrors and the traumas that are being exposed, is a way of showing it in a new way so that it does engender a visceral response. Like, people will become aware of how it actually was versus seeing it sort of through this filtered lens, right? Because it seems to me that war and war reporting had been going along a certain path from war to war. More and more of the atrocities and damage that was being caused, and then the traumas that were being experienced, were coming to light, and that also rose with a anti-war sentiment in the population. And we saw that in the 1960s in the United States. There's a big anti-war movement because of what was happening after the Korean War and into the Vietnam War. But a lot of the reporting we were seeing at that time was, fairly unfiltered. And then you move forward to our generation. I grew up on like the Gulf War, and it looked like a video game. And then the embedded reporters in Gulf War II were basically like in front of green screens and like made up.
Oh yeah, there's a lot of fake.
Yeah, a lot of
shit out of that era. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's like when Hillary Clinton said that she was getting shot at getting off the plane in Yugoslavia or whatever. I mean, it never happened. There's video of it. She's clearly lying.
But more to your point, there was literally blue screen reporting.
Right. Yeah.
They used fake footage. They made fake news.
But I think what that is doing is it's separating the horrors of the war from the visibility, from the view of the public. And so that chops away at the root of the anti-war sentiment, because if you don't see what's happening, then you're not aware of it, right? And so it's easier and easier to become more accepting of the propaganda and the lies that you're told in media and in the government schooling. And so I think that might be a big reason why we're seeing less and less anti-war sentiment in today's day and age. Especially, I mean, like we talked about earlier, Tulsi is the only candidate out there who's even mentioning it, and she's being blackballed because of her stance on this, when it was a very mainstream position, even last election or two elections prior.
Yeah, well, we have this idea that there was some sort of golden age of journalism where like reporters did their job as like the guardians of truth, and they unearthed all this corruption, and that was never the case. Any reporter that actually did honest journalism was an outlier, right? We invent these media technologies like the printing press and stuff, and we just started printing out propaganda flyers.
Right, and I don't mean to put them on a pedestal at that time in like the 60s and 70s. What I'm saying is that perhaps the media military conglomerate complex didn't have their arms around it, so what did get out wasn't controlled enough.
What's interesting to me is this. Okay, so like as media technology progressed, we've had this struggle with governments or concentrations of power trying to dominate through narrative, and the democratization of media is like in direct conflict with that. So it's like we develop a printing press or the internet, and these technologies empower people, and then they scramble to try to make that funneled up to a centralized thing again. Like the media has always been an extension of government.
Right. Yeah.
And so like you say, so yeah, like the reason that Vietnam was just such a fucking slog for the government was because they had footage of it. So what they had to do is like sort of undermine the whole anti-war movement with drugs and hedonism and embed CIA members through Mockingbird into the media to start like spinning the cultural, like the zeitgeist towards hedonism to try to get them off of the anti-war.
Right. And then in today's age, we've got, we're so filtered away from the carnage that when those things do get leaked, it's not the atrocities that people are upset about. It's the fact that they got leaked, and the whistleblowers that bring them out are demonized.
Yeah, sometimes for sure. But like I said, I think there's a lot of hope in the fact that like the more educated we get and the better media technology gets, the more people get ideas out and have conversations. So I think you're right in sort of the core of people, but there's a lot of people that do have that conversation still.
Right.
And like there's a lot of YouTubers that are talking constantly about the news and all these atrocities happening, and like when there's a quote unquote revolution going on somewhere, like Twitter's lit up like from that place. They're displaying, when the French police were beating like elderly people in the streets, like they had footage of it, right? And so on the end of the power centers here, they're spinning it with all sorts of distractions and other stories and then spinning those stories. But like if you want to see that, you can find it quite easily.
Right. Yeah. And I guess to come full circle back to this movie, I'm hopeful that it is seen as an anti-war film because it does bring out a new perspective in something that people might have been familiar with, but only from grainy footage, to where they actually see how bad it was. And if this got more visibility, it's on HBO right now. It had a limited release in the United States, but if more people saw this, they might get sort of that feeling of an anti-war sentiment back more so than they seem to have today. Yeah,
like the only thing that really ever sort of covers up the horrors of war are when we allow it to be an honorable thing, like there's glory in all the sacrificing, and the only way that can occur is if they allow us to be like masculine again. So like one of those two things has to give in the narrative in order for them to make this positive, make war continue to be positive. Because you can't be like, okay, men suck and violence is terrible, and then simultaneously like these guys are sacrificed, because like that's the narrative, right? Is that like the soldiers sacrifice themselves for the betterment of society? That's how you justify these horrific conditions that the soldiers go through and all the trauma and all the violence. And so like
but there's so much cognitive dissonance in the public.
Yeah, no, 100% for sure.
But it's like both of those things true at the same time.
Yeah,
that's true. It's a lot of double speak, a lot of double think. But like I said, like it's becoming less and less efficient the more complicated an indoctrination system gets, right? Like they're to the point where you're not allowed to talk about anything. They have to police the perimeter of all conversations and just spin everything. And every time Project Veritas leaks something, even if it's got a bias and even if it's like heavily edited and you can kind of see that they have a bias, like they have a slant, like every time something like that happens, people are being like woken up. I don't really like that. They've kind of commandeered the idea of woke, but like it is an enlightening experience, right? To be assaulted with these new ideas, be like, hey, this is what's happening in the world, right?
Right, and we never know what's going to be the thing that is that seed that gets planted that sparks somebody to go and dig further. I mean, I think it's been different for me, as from you, as for, many people. There's a different thing that kind of catches them. That's one of the reasons why we do this show. We hope that people who listen, they have a little bit of interest and maybe perhaps pursue it a bit further, like with the Dan Carlin podcast or with the links that we're going to have on the from the Mises Institute on the show notes page for this one.
Okay, well, I feel like plugging my shit right now, actually, because that was what I was going for with this last album. I don't know, like you obviously like Boys Will Be Boys a lot better because it's like hyper masculine and really fun, and right.
And but just like me.
What?
just like me.
You. Nice. As a side note, the White Feather campaign of calling men cowards for not joining was so effective that the British government had to issue like stay-at-home badges of honor so that men could wear because they needed they couldn't have everyone join. They needed people to produce munitions and run the post office and shit like that, right? You can't have everybody go. So they had to issue these badges so enough men could stay home without being accosted by these women handing out feathers.
Yeah,
that was kind of funny.
That's another interesting thing to see in the film. At the end, when the soldiers came home back to England, how they were not treated very well. And
No, they're always discarded soldiers. It sucks.
yeah. And I remember that being a thing after the Vietnam War, but I thought that was because of all the anti-war sentiment in the population. But in World War I, it seemed like everyone was like gung ho about, the war is going to be great. Let's go and do this. It's adventurous. It's noble. It's whatever. But then when they came home, it's like the people didn't even really care. It's like,
No, and they're kind of like they've lost their manners too. So like they're a little more brutish and like give a shit about things less. Like they don't care as much about like certain rituals and etiquette. So they probably have a demeanor that's much more like comfortable with their own body and also like maybe a little bit of aggressiveness to it. So that's going to put people off. And then they weren't there in the war and they don't really appreciate what actually happened or anything. So they just kind of discard these people. And simultaneously, it's like, especially with like veterans and like being wounded and stuff, it's like really costs. It's quite a burden for the society. So it's better to just pretend it's not there. And, I think that's why we do that. I don't know.
I wonder if the propaganda was different, perhaps, for World War II. I mean, that's when like those newsreels would play before movies, and it was all exciting about all the events that were happening, and he was more triumphant and celebrated as far as a victory goes.
Oh yeah, we did. Yeah, they did have a good return when they came home. They were honored.
Yeah, World War II, but
only for a bit. Like only aesthetically. Like a lot of men had a hard time finding work and stuff like that, right? Like the economy was booming though, so that was the benefit as well.
Right. Well, it became booming because you just released all these resources back into the free market, back into.
Well, they also took resources from the places you invaded too, right? Essentially, is that
I don't know so much in World War II. I know that it just took all these misallocated.
Yeah,
things
that's true. Yeah, and dump it back into the thing, right?
Right.
Well, and then on top of that, there's like the huge, and then the Fed would have been like printing money, manipulating the money so that like we'd have a boom kind of engineered out of that.
Well, and you can actually make cars and tires again. I mean, there were no cars made from 1942 to 1945.
Yeah, so you got all this stimulated industries that were producing tanks or whatever are now producing cars, and they're already in fifth gear, ready to go. All these companies and stuff. So yeah, it'd be like kind of a housing boom, right? Where you'd just be overproducing shit and everything would become affordable and.
Right. And then all the people who were earning money during the war producing these things, they didn't have the money. They didn't have anything to spend it on. So then there was this nut of savings that kind of happened. And then once consumer goods started being made again, then you had this flourishing. But
yeah, because there would have been rationing too, right?
Yeah. There was a rationing, which basically it was like a double price kind of system.
So I think the governments hadn't learned that in World War I yet, that trick. And so you come back and it's just kind of same. Nothing's really changed. You're just kind of like, maybe you're missing an arm, or maybe you're a bit of an asshole because like you've seen all your friends die and you having a hard time dealing with that emotionally.
Yeah. Well, what do you say we start to wind this down? We're about over an hour here. So, Robert, do you have any other notes before we get into the final summary and review stuff?
Well, I just wanted to get back to what Mike C. was talking about with the White Feather Campaign. The reason why that White Feather Campaign was so effective, and it was basically where they would have these young, attractive groups of women rove around the streets, and if they saw any man of like fighting age out about, they would go up to him and shame him by putting this white feather on him or giving it to him. And public shaming is massively effective because it attacks your sense of masculinity, your sense of group belonging. Right? You're seen as like an outsider. You're not contributing to the protection of the society. You're not seen as the protector, and that's your job as a man. So it's just this predatory state that turns the best things about men into a destructive force. And that's just another reason to really hate the state.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well said. All right. Well, I think we're gonna have to call it here. So let's get into final summaries and reviews. And Robert, you want to start us off?
Sure. Yeah. So Pete Jackson came out with this film, and I didn't expect it from him, but the guy does all kinds of stuff. He's done fantasy, he's done horror, he's done anti-war or war. Usually when you get a war movie, it's more of a war propaganda film, but this just lets the soldiers tell their own story. So it ends up being an anti-war film, even though I would say the soldiers themselves at some point, talk about how they are having a good time. Because there is some aspects of, like we said, this show to being around a bunch of other guys with a task to achieve. Men really are task driven. We like doing things. We like accomplishing things. We like fixing things. And sometimes we like, taking orders and having something to do, the clear goal. Unfortunately, with war, that is rarely the case. And that often leads to a lot of frustration with the people that end up fighting wars, is they say that they weren't allowed to win the war, or they didn't see the purpose in what they were doing a lot of the time. Because a lot of times it's less, it doesn't suit the political needs of the people in charge to win the war or to take certain objectives or to destroy certain things. So that happened a lot in the Vietnam War. That's well documented. But I'm sure in all wars it's been the case, where winning a war and fighting a war are not the same thing. And you see that a little bit in this film, where waves of human bodies are thrown at barbed wire and machine gun nests to what? Take a couple 100 yards of ground. What, are you going to do that all the way to Berlin? How many human lives is that going to cost you? How many millions and millions of human lives is that going to cost you? I know the generals were coming from a previous war. They had to learn the new tactics. I know the term rolling thunder was a technique of artillery bombardment invented in the First World War, because before that, the artillery was not synchronized with troop movements. But when they finally figured it out, that they would bombard the area just ahead of the troops and kind of follow them as they advanced, it was way more effective. But before that, you had a whole bunch of your own artillery landing on your own troops. You had, like what happened in the movie, you're running into barbed wire that's not cut when it was supposed to be. So you're sitting there getting machine gunned while you're trying to cut barbed wire. That's always fun. Anyway, yeah, the movie itself is quite well done. It's a technical achievement. Like Mike said, I don't even know how exactly they did all this. I mean, either the AI is just getting really good at figuring out what these frames were supposed to look like. So maybe in the future it'll look even better as the technology gets even better. But it really looks great now, and it's well worth your time to watch this. It's a pretty important film. It's well done. It's not as political perspective as I would like, but it's an honest film. I'll say that. That's my final word, is that this is a very, very honest film. So a number, it's like an 8.5. If you want to give it a number, I don't know.
All right. I think that's a good number. I think that works. And I have similar sentiments to you. I mean, it is pretty amazing. And it turns out that they actually did colorize about 100 hours of footage. And we only see about 2 hours of the footage here. But for the Imperial War Museum, Peter Jackson's team ended up colorizing all of it, everything that they had. And so it's pretty amazing. And I kind of view it as... in the right light, yeah, this is an anti-war film because of sort of my theory that, it brings it more to life and makes it more real for people. But it also seems almost as if it's made for a museum, like an exhibit, to where you're watching and you're just hearing the recollections of the people, and you're watching the footage, and it's, made more real. But it's also very direct and kind of dry, and there's no real sense of place or time. It was really unclear to me in watching this whether I was watching sort of a progression across a number of years, or if it was a couple of weeks, or what was really happening. And if I were to rewatch it again, I still don't know if I could pick up on it. I think by the end it was the end of the war, and the beginning was the beginning of the war, but that's the span of 4 years. But it certainly isn't presented as such, and there's no sense of place. And I think that was intentional on Peter Jackson's part, because he wasn't trying to provide a historical account of this battle and this event and that event, and this happened at this time, this happened at the other time, because you get that all over the place, right? There's accounts of it, all of those big events and big battles in history books and documentaries and things already done. So in a way, it's sort of like this almost more, what was the experience like for the people who were there, and how do we make it more real? But in that, I sort of didn't get the sense of where things were at in the progression. And so that was a bit of a demerit for me. So I'm going to go with an 8. So not your 8.5, but it's still really well done. It's an amazing technological achievement. And I do highly recommend that people do check it out. It is on HBO right now, and it is available for purchase, which our guest Mike C had to do in Canadian funds, unfortunately, but they still accepted them, and now he owns the digital rights to this film himself.
Well, read the fine print.
So, Mike, why don't you give us your final summary and review, and then we will button up this episode of The Last Nighters.
I would define objective evil as the subversion of a laudable quality to the subjugation of the person and the betterment of and control to a concentration of power. If that makes sense. So, like when the government takes a good quality, or even when Coca-Cola takes a good quality that we have and subverts it or inverts it to something to nefarious end, I think that's truly like how I would define evil. And you see this sort of through the objectivity of Jackson just presenting, like the men just talking about what happened to them and everything, which I sort of caught on at the beginning. Like a lot of the beginning, like they all just kind of signed up and everything was good, and like it's a laudable quality to want to like defend your home and things like that. It's a laudable quality to like want to be a hero and things like that. And it's just terrible to see that used against a young man. So I really enjoyed that. And I think like coming back to the narrative of the actual sort of timeline of this, I think there's an emotional arc that makes sense. And then it just kind of bookends with the beginning of the war and the end of the war, and everything is in line. And it makes sense in a vague way. I think like there's a real like, well, there's a through narrative to it. So I didn't feel lost at any point. It does kind of almost belong in a museum. It's certainly a documentary approach, but there was like he managed to tell a story in a very like effective and efficient way. So I'm quite impressed. I'd say 9 probably.
All right,
and like I said, I forgive him. I forgive him for making The Hobbit essentially.
The Hobbit trilogy, the whole thing.
Yeah, well, actually, specifically that orc that was like underneath the ice, and you think he's dead, and then he like comes out of the ice. That part,
he gets a pass for that.
The Jar Jar Binks of The Hobbit.
Yeah, that scene just made me like, I'm like, you've betrayed us as audience members, but now I feel like he's back in the black. So,
all right, well, very
good.
Read
in the ledger before for sure.
Well, thank you again for filling in on this episode. You brought an interesting perspective, as you always do, and I feel like that we had an entirely different conversation than we were going to have had.
Yeah, I hope I didn't sound too crazy.
Oh, yeah.
I felt a bit kind of out of it, like trying to pull these threads together, but.
No, I think that's enough. I mean, just
okay.
Get people interested, and they can do their own research and see what they can find out. But definitely check out this film, and have your family and friends watch it as well, because it is amazingly done. It's a new perspective on an old event that people are probably already a bit familiar with, and that can only benefit truth and light in the world, seeing things for what they actually are, and how bad things were that these guys went through. And the thing that stuck with me in watching this was just what an atrocious waste war is. Just
that's fair.
Yeah, and the arbitrary nature of which side are you on? So we're gonna try and kill each other now. Like those German guys, British guys are like, oh, they're just fine. They're good guys. They went to school with us, and we would have been friends, but instead we're just trying to kill each other.
Right. Yep. Exactly. So anyway, that's our take on They Shall Not Grow Old for Armistice Day. This year, the end of the war was 101 years ago on the 11th. And so thank you guys for joining us for this episode. Thank you, Mike C. People can check you out at Mechanical Dream Revolution on SoundCloud. We will have a link to that on lastnighters.com/97. And next week, we have another guest coming up. We're going to be doing the Breaking Bad movie, El Camino, with Jared Wall of Anarcho Land and Breaking Anarchy, I think is what his other website is, and it's an analysis of the Breaking Bad series with libertarian themes spelled out. So anything he finds in the series, he writes a book about it, and he does articles about it on his website. And it reminds me of what we kind of do on this show, where we talk about movies from a certain perspective. He's looking at a very specific and very well done television series in Breaking Bad. So we'll be having him next week for the El Camino movie, which should be a lot of fun.
Absolutely. One of my favorite series of all time. So I haven't seen the El Camino yet. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, available on the old Netflix. So people do check that out. If you would like to have watched that before listening to us talk about it and say a bunch of nonsense. It'll be a good time. But Mike, thank you again for joining us. I hope you can stick around for some of our Kathleen Turner Overdrive, which is the bonus content available for our Patreon supporters, and they can find that at lastnerds.com/Patreon. Any other ways people can support us, Robert? I know you've got a good list. You memorized this. You've said it a number of times, and you can bark it out on command.
Well, I make it up as I go along, but people can leave a like. They can support us on Facebook. They can sign up to our Facebook group. They can subscribe to us on YouTube. They can leave a review on iTunes. They can go to Trubster.com and buy some merch. They can tell their friends about it. They can tell themselves about it in their dreams. They can tell their family about it. They can, they can write in the sky about it if they want to like rent a plane and do that. But anything they do that promotes the cause of liberty is aces in my book. So thank you in advance for all those great things. You're the best.
All right, very good. Any final words from you, Mike, before we get into some bonus content?
War is really bad, unless it's good, I guess. Unless it's necessary, quotation marks. They didn't take those babies out of incubators in Kuwait. That was a lie. So don't listen to the media. That's they're full of shit.
I keep hearing this. The media is an enemy of the people, and it's starting to seem more and more accurate.
Is an extension of the state. So by virtue of the libertarian principle, which I'm more of a minarchist, I think, or like a libertarian fascist sort of. But the principle of anarchy or moving towards liberty is that, the state needs to be put in check, and the mainstream media tends to be an extension of power structures. So they are the same people.
Right. Not a check at all. They're an enabler.
Yes, absolutely.
Provide some cover.
So, try to spread the word. You talked earlier about, I'll make this really quick. You talked earlier about how to plant those seeds, and that's what memes are. So we just have to figure out how to reduce ideas down to getting people to question stuff and be willing to plant those seeds and come back in a couple of years. Epstein didn't kill himself.
All right, very good. Well, thanks again, Mike, for joining us, and thank you, audience, for listening to us. You can find the show notes more at lastnerds.com/97 and also on the Launchpad Media, where they're always launching new ideas in your direction. And with that, we'll say good night from last night. Proposed to you. I went down on one knee and said, "Hey, if our primo guest falls through, would you be our backup guest?" And you very graciously accepted that offer. You had said that the name of the film was based on a poem about Flanders Fields, and that was a Canadian regiment that was fighting in World War I. I just wanted to get a little bit more of the background on that, if you're willing, before we wrap up the show and get into our Kathleen Turner Overdrive.
Yeah, it was a soldier came home and wrote a poem, and they immortalized that. Basically, I'm just looking up the name of the guy. What's his name? Canadian physician. Oh, okay, so he would have been a little bit less in danger and a little more privy to the horrors. And so he wrote the poem, take up our quarrel with the foe, from failing hands, we throw the torch, be yours to hold it high. If ye break faith with those who die, we shall not rest, something like that.
And so one of the lines is similar to "They shall not grow old," or grow old, they shall not. I think
they shall not sleep till poppies grow. Yeah, I don't know. Maybe that line actually isn't in here. I thought it was.
Okay, I read something that said that the poem itself says "grow old, they shall not." So it's like a different arrangement of the lettering or the letters. Yeah. But
Flanders fields the poppies grow between the crosses row and row. To mark our place and in the sky the larks still bravely singing fly. Scarce heard amid the guns below. We are the dead short days ago. We lived, felt dawn, saw sunset glow. Loved and were loved, and now we lie in Flanders field. Yeah, he doesn't actually say they shall not grow old. So that must be from something else. It just sounded so similar. I assumed that was it. But yeah, he came back and wrote this poem, and everyone was like, "Oh, we should make this the poster for remembrance." And so we have the poppy here. I don't know. You guys you don't do a poppy, eh?
No, but I have seen it. I did see while I was on my vacation with my kids at the virtual water world of the Great Wolf Lodge. We did see some of the NHL hockey matches, and all of the announcers were wearing a poppy because of the week that this is. And so that's all related to that. Like it's about what do you guys call it in Canada? Is it Armistice Day or is it Veterans Day?
Called Remembrance Day.
Remembrance Day. Okay. And it is on the 11th, right?
Yep.
Okay. And I actually prefer Remembrance Day to Veterans Day.
Yeah,
and
Memorial is like close too, right?
Right. Yeah. And Armistice Day, I think, is far more appropriate. And I kind of wish I had stayed that way, because the spirit of that is like the ceasing of fighting.
Yeah,
Right.
they need to be able to utilize that good thing to promote the wars that they want to fight soon, or the wars that are currently happening, right? So, like, often the government will include like victims in Afghanistan and stuff, right, and make and sort of pay special attention to that, so you can't just stay as a propaganda tool. It can't just stay Armistice, because then it doesn't serve the modern purpose.
Right. Yeah. Robert, I want to bring you in the conversation before we wrap up the show here. Any comments related to the poem, or our take on the change from Armistice Day to Veterans Day, or Remembrance Day in Canada?
No, I don't know anything about the poem, but it does strike me as a very poetic title to the film. So I imagine it has some sort of poetic roots. But yeah, the Armistice Day change to Veterans Day is absolutely to distance yourself from, ending war good, to look at these fallen heroes, how they died for your freedoms. Don't forget their sacrifices to the noble cause that, you enjoy your livelihood today because of their sacrifice, and that sort of nonsense. You have to have their death be put in the most noble light, because they're associated with government action, and government action is always the most noble thing.
Right. And it changing from Armistice Day, which is a reinstitution of peace, that doesn't promote the agenda of more wars, but Veterans Day does, because, well, if you're celebrating veterans, then you can always make more veterans.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And one final note on They Shall Not Grow Old. It is very poignant, because in the opening of the film, it talks about the people enlisting, and they're all like 15, 16, 17 years old, lying about their age. And up to 1 million of the English soldiers die. So you got all these people dying. So they won't grow old. And then Ralph Raico, in his talk that I kept referencing, he said that of all the children, all the baby boys born in France in 1892, 1/2 of them will be killed or injured, or a casualty in World War I. So it's half of an entire generation.
And the echoes of all those dead are felt today. I mean, every human being is an economic actor, whether they want to be an economic actor or not. And everybody, almost 99% of the time, we are positive economic actors. And all those dead bodies, all those people would have been productive and would have been working to make everybody else's life better. And we would have all felt that, and would have been far more prosperous today were it not for them dying in this pointless war, and every soldier dying in every pointless war. And all these people would have all been contributing to make your life better. So bring the troops home, stop these stupid wars, and let's get on with having a better life.
I don't think we could end it on any better of a note. So, Mike C., thank you again for being our guest. Audience, thank you for joining us for this episode on They Shall Not Grow Old. And we will be back next week talking about El Camino. I hope you'll join us then as well. So, maximum freedom, everyone. Peace out.
The Chipmunks. CHIPMUNK. We're the Chipmunks. Guaranteed to brighten your day. Do 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 do.
In the early days of the internet, radical libertarians were scattered, lonely, and faceless. Without direction, they resigned to scour the web, sifting through content providers in a wasteland plagued by YouTube demonetization, Facebook jail, and covert internet censorship. But then, in 2017, the Libertarian Union was formed. Finally, the average Joe libertarian could find a thriving community of independent podcasters and content providers, all in one convenient location. At Libertarian Union, we'll always have the latest news, interviews, discussions, and even movie reviews. With hundreds of episodes and more added all the time, you'll always find something fresh at libertarianunion.com.